The first time he understood power, he was 7 years old, standing in the rain outside a gymnasium that smelled of sweat and leather and dreams deferred. Through the foggy window, he watched men dance. That's what it looked like to him then, dancing, their bodies moving in rhythms he couldn't name, but somehow understood in his bones. One man, darker than the others, moved like water, like wind, like something that couldn't be caught or contained. And the boy pressed his small hand against the cold glass and whispered a promise to no one and everyone, "That's going to be me." His name then didn't matter. Names are given, not earned. What mattered was the fire that started in his chest that day, a fire that would consume everything and everyone in its path, including, eventually, himself. He grew up in a neighborhood where dreams went to die quietly, where men worked until their backs bent and their spirits broke, where women sang in churches on Sunday and cried in kitchens on Monday. His father painted signs for a living, grand advertisements for businesses that would never hire him, his hands always stained with colors that promised futures he would never see. His mother cleaned houses, scrubbing floors in homes larger than the one she raised her children in, and she sang while she worked, hymns that spoke of a better world waiting somewhere beyond this one. But the boy didn't want to wait for heaven. He wanted glory here, now, in this life, in this body. The gymnasium became his church, the ring became his altar, and the old trainer who finally let him in, a man with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen every kind of fighter and every kind of fool, became something between a prophet and a prison guard. "You got speed," the old man said after watching him hit the bag for the first time, "but speed ain't enough. Speed without purpose is just running away." "I ain't running from nothing," the boy said, his jaw set, his fists still clenched. "Then what you running toward?" He didn't have an answer then. It would take years and blood and broken bones and shattered friendships and a kind of loneliness that comes from standing on a mountain while everyone else stays in the valley, before he understood what he was chasing. At first, it was simple. Win. Every fight, every round, every exchange. He fought in dusty local gyms where the crowds numbered in dozens, where the prize was pocket change and a handshake. He fought with a style that made purists angry and crowds ecstatic. Hands low, head back, feet dancing in patterns that seemed reckless until you realized he was never where the punch was landing. He talked too, even then, predicting rounds, rhyming insults, building his own mythology one boast at a time. "You can't hit what you can't see," he'd say, grinning, and then he'd prove it. The victories piled up like stones in a monument he was building to himself. Regional titles, national attention, and then, impossibly, the gold. An Olympic medal hung around his neck while anthems played and cameras flashed, and the world, for one moment, saw him as he saw himself. Unconquerable. He came home a hero, parades in streets that had never celebrated anyone like him, strangers knowing his name, doors opening that had been locked his entire life. He wore the medal everywhere, even to sleep, because it was proof, tangible proof that he had escaped, that he had transcended, that he was no longer bound by the limitations that held everyone he knew in place. But America in those days had a strange relationship with its heroes. It loved them in the arena and feared them in the streets. He learned this when he walked into a restaurant, medal gleaming on his chest, and was told, politely but firmly, that he couldn't sit at the counter. The waitress wouldn't meet his eyes. The other diners stared at their plates, and something in him, something that had been sleeping beneath the confidence and the boasts and the dreams, woke up angry. He threw the medal into the river that night, or maybe he kept it locked in a drawer. The story changed depending on who told it, but the truth was in the gesture itself. A rejection, a realization that winning wasn't enough, that glory without dignity was just another kind of slavery. He turned professional with a fury that frightened even his supporters. He didn't just fight opponents. He demolished them, erased them, made them question whether they belonged in the same ring. His style evolved from fast to supernatural. His predictions from boasts to prophecies that came true with eerie accuracy. Round 5, he'd say, and in round 5, his opponent would fall. He became not just a fighter, but a force, a phenomenon, something people traveled across countries to witness. But with the wins came the hunger for something more than victory. He wanted to be heard. He wanted to speak. He started talking about things fighters weren't supposed to talk about race, about injustice, about the hypocrisies he saw everywhere he looked. He joined movements that made powerful people uncomfortable. He changed his name, declared himself reborn, insisted that the world call him by his chosen identity rather than the one given to him by a history he hadn't chosen, and the world resisted. They called him controversial. They called him troublemaker. They called him everything but what he was, a man trying to be free in a world that preferred its heroes grateful and quiet. The biggest fight came not in a ring but in a courtroom. The government wanted him to fight in a war he didn't believe in, to kill people who had never called him the names his own countrymen used, to serve a nation that served him only when he was winning. He refused, not quietly, not apologetically, but loudly, proudly, with the same confidence he brought to every fight. "I ain't got no quarrel with them people," he said, and those words would echo through decades. They stripped him of everything, his titles, his license, his livelihood. The same governing bodies that had celebrated him now exiled him. He was 25 years old in his prime, and suddenly he wasn't allowed to do the only thing he'd ever been extraordinary at. 3.5 years, the peak years of any fighter's life, stolen not by an opponent but by principle, by choice, by a refusal to compromise the person he had become for the fighter they wanted him to be. During those years, he became something unexpected, a symbol. He spoke at colleges, at rallies, at gatherings of people who saw in him a different kind of courage than the one displayed in boxing rings. He was vilified by half the country and sanctified by the other half. He went from champion to pariah to prophet, all without throwing a single punch. But inside, where no cameras reached and no crowds could cheer, he was struggling. The identity he had built, the greatest fighter alive, had been taken from him. Who was he without the ring? What was he without the roar of crowds? He had sacrificed everything for his principles, but principles don't pay rent, don't fill stadiums, don't give a man purpose when he wakes up every morning with hands that remember how to hurt, but no one to fight. His wife left him during this time, or maybe he left her. The details blurred, but the pain was sharp. Another thing sacrificed to the altar of his convictions. His children grew up in a house where their father was both present and absent, famous and forgotten, principled and lost. When they finally let him fight again, he was different. Slower, maybe, older, certainly, but hungrier than he'd ever been, not for victory but for vindication, for proof that the sacrifice had been worth it, that standing for something meant more than falling for anything. His comeback fight was against the man who had taken his title, a fighter who was younger, stronger, favored by everyone who understood the mathematics of pugilism. But mathematics couldn't measure what he carried into that ring. 3.5 years of rage and redemption, of waiting and wanting, of being told he was finished and refusing to believe it. He won. Not easily, not prettily, but definitively. He stood in the center of the ring afterward, arms raised, not in triumph, but in something deeper, in affirmation, in existence, in proof that they could take everything from him except the thing that made him who he was. But the victory tasted different than the ones before. It was sweeter and more bitter at the same time. He had won, but what had he lost? The years he couldn't get back, the relationships that had crumbled under the weight of his choices, the version of himself that used to move like water and wind. now replaced by something slower, more deliberate, more human. He fought for years after that, defending his reclaimed title, losing it, winning it back again, his body and his legend both becoming things that defied natural law. Every fight was a miracle and a tragedy, a miracle that he could still do it, a tragedy that he still needed to. The opponents got younger while he got older. The easy predictions stopped because the outcomes became less certain. He started taking damage, real damage, the kind that didn't heal between rounds. His face, once unmarked and beautiful, became a map of wars fought and barely won. His speech, once rapid-fire and poetic, began to slow, words coming harder, thoughts taking longer to form, but he couldn't stop, or wouldn't, or didn't know how. The real battle, the one he never expected, the one that would bring him to his knees in a way no opponent ever could, started so gradually he didn't notice at first. A tremor in his hand, a slight slur in his speech, moments where his body didn't respond the way he commanded it to. He was still fighting when the symptoms became undeniable, still training when doctors started using words like degeneration and progressive and irreversible, still convinced that the same willpower that had carried him through every other fight would carry him through this one. It wouldn't. This opponent was patient. It didn't fight in rounds. It didn't care about his legacy or his courage or his refusal to surrender. It just waited, inevitable and methodical, stealing pieces of him day by day, punch by punch, until the man who had moved like poetry moved like prose, then like fragmented sentences, then like silence. He fought one last time when he shouldn't have. Everyone around him knew it. His trainers, his doctors, his family, they all begged him not to. But he couldn't conceive of himself as anything other than a fighter, couldn't imagine an identity that didn't include the ring. So he went one more time, against an opponent who was younger and stronger and completely unaware that he was fighting not just a man but a ghost, a memory, a legend that refused to accept its own mortality. He lost, badly, not just the fight but something essential about how he saw himself. In the dressing room afterward, alone except for the mirrors that showed him who he had become, he finally understood. This was the battle he couldn't win, not with speed, not with skill, not with courage or will or any of the weapons that had served him his entire life. The years that followed were the cruelest. The world watched him slow down, shut down, become trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. The hands that had moved faster than cameras could capture now shook when they tried to hold a pen. The voice that had proclaimed itself the greatest now whispered, then fell silent. But something strange happened in that silence. The anger that had fueled so much of his life, the anger at injustice, at limitations, at anyone who told him what he couldn't do, began to transform into something else. Not peace, exactly, but acceptance. Not surrender, but understanding. He learned to communicate with his eyes when his mouth wouldn't cooperate. He learned to be present when he couldn't be powerful. He learned that maybe, just maybe, the fighting had never been the point. Maybe it had been preparation for this, for the moment when all the armor had to come off, when all the boasts had to be set aside, when he had to face the world not as the greatest, but as simply himself, simply human, simply here. People still came to see him, not to hear predictions or watch him dance, but just to be near him, to witness the strange grace that comes from facing the unbeatable opponent with dignity. He became a different kind of symbol, not of strength but of vulnerability, not of conquest but of endurance, not of transcendence but of profound, aching humanity. In his final years, he attended events in a wheelchair, his body mostly still, his face a mask that couldn't show the thoughts and feelings that still lived behind it. And people would approach him, former opponents, old friends, strangers whose lives he'd touched in ways he never knew, and they would thank him, not for the victories but for the losses, not for being invincible, but for proving that even the greatest among us must eventually fall, and that there is dignity in the falling. The little boy who pressed his hand against the gymnasium window would have been confused by this version of the man he became. Where were the championships? Where was the dancing? Where was the proof of greatness? But the old man in the wheelchair understood something the boy never could, that the real fight was never in the ring. It was in the quiet moments between the roar of crowds. It was in the choices that cost him everything but gave him himself. It was in learning that being conquered doesn't mean being defeated, that losing your power doesn't mean losing your purpose, that the greatest victory might be simply enduring, simply being, simply facing each diminishing day with the same courage it took to face any opponent. He died on a quiet evening, not in a ring, but in a room surrounded by the people who had stayed when the glory faded, who had loved the man more than the legend, who understood that his real triumph wasn't in never being beaten, but in never stopping being himself, even when himself was all he had left. They said he was the greatest. They said he was unconquerable. And in the ways that mattered, in principle, in courage, in the refusal to let anyone else define who he was supposed to be, they were right. But the truth he discovered, the one that the boy who started this journey could never have imagined, was simpler and more profound. He was human, spectacularly, gloriously, tragically human, and in the end, that was enough. That was everything. The world mourned when he passed. They remembered the predictions, the dancing, the battles against opponents and injustice and the forces that tried to break him. They played clips of him in his prime, floating across the canvas like gravity didn't apply to him, like the rules that governed ordinary men were just suggestions he chose to ignore. But those who knew him best, who stayed through the tremors and the silence and the slow fading, they remembered something else. They remembered the way he smiled with his eyes when his mouth couldn't move, the way he held hands with children, his grip weak but his presence enormous, the way he turned his final fight, not against an opponent in a ring, but against the limitations of his own failing body, into a different kind of poetry, a quieter kind of courage. His funeral was attended by kings and former presidents, by celebrities and activists, by people who had only seen him through television screens, and people who had known him when he was just a kid, with fast hands and big dreams. They came from every corner of the world, representing every faith and philosophy and perspective, all united by the strange alchemy that had turned a fighter into something more, into a mirror where humanity could see both its potential and its limits reflected back. The eulogy spoke of victories and championships, of battles won and titles claimed, but it also spoke of the battles lost, the prices paid, the ways that glory demands sacrifice and fame requires pieces of the soul. It spoke of a man who had everything, lost everything, found everything again in a different form, and finally let everything go with a grace that only comes from truly understanding what matters. In the cemetery, as they lowered him into the ground, an old woman who had known him as a child, before the fame and the fights and the transformation, whispered something that no one else heard. He was always just trying to be free, and maybe that was the real story all along. Not about becoming the greatest, but about becoming free. Free from the expectations that tried to define him. Free from the limitations that society tried to impose. Free from the fear that keeps most people from ever discovering who they truly are. Free even eventually from the prison of his own body, his own legend, his own past. The boy at the gymnasium window had wanted to be unconquerable. The man in the wheelchair had learned something more valuable, that being conquered is part of being alive, that falling is inevitable, that the real courage isn't in never being beaten but in standing up, in whatever form standing takes, every single time. His legacy became complicated in death, as all legacies do. Some remembered him primarily as an athlete, the greatest boxer who ever lived, the man who proved that skill and speed and intelligence could overcome raw power. Others remembered him as an activist, the man who sacrificed everything for his principles, who stood against a war and paid the price and never apologized. Still others remembered him as a cautionary tale, the fighter who stayed too long, who paid in brain cells and motor function for the pride of never quitting. But perhaps the most complete understanding came from those who saw all of it together, the triumph and the tragedy, the glory and the suffering, the moments of transcendent greatness, and the long years of diminishment. They understood that his story was compelling not in spite of its contradictions, but because of them, that he was fascinating precisely because he was flawed, that he became immortal not by being perfect, but by being perfectly, courageously, defiantly human. Years after his death, new generations discovered him through archived footage and documentary films. They watched him predict the round of his victories with the confidence of a prophet. They heard him speak truth to power with a clarity that still resonates across decades. They saw him light the Olympic torch at the 1996 Games, his hand trembling but his spirit unbroken, and they understood that courage has many faces, and some of them, a special few, would stand outside gymnasiums in neighborhoods that still smell of sweat and leather and dreams deferred, pressing their small hands against foggy windows, watching others dance with their fists, whispering promises to no one and everyone. The cycle continues. The fire passes from one generation to the next, and somewhere in the space between ambition and acceptance, between the first punch thrown and the last breath taken, his ghost still dances, still speaks, still reminds us that greatness isn't measured in victories alone, but in the courage to be yourself, even when yourself is never enough and always too much, never right and always necessary. He conquered every ring, every opponent, every crowd, but the one battle he never expected, the one that brought him to his knees and taught him what strength really means, wasn't fought with fists. It was fought with faith, faith in himself, faith in something larger than himself, faith that the journey matters more than the destination, that the fighting matters more than the winning, that being alive, truly alive, means accepting both the glory and the suffering as parts of the same indivisible whole. They called him the greatest, and maybe he was. But his real greatness wasn't in being unconquerable. It was in learning how to be conquered with grace, how to fall with dignity, how to face the end of his career, of his health, of his life, with the same fierce honesty that he brought to everything else. The boy at the window became the man in the ring, became the legend on the screen, became the ghost in memory. And in that transformation, in that arc from flesh to myth, he proved something essential about the human condition, that we are all fighting battles we cannot win, that we are all losing to time and circumstance and the limitations of our bodies, and that the measure of a life isn't whether we win, but how we fight, who we become in the fighting, what we stand for when standing costs us everything. In the end, he was just a man who learned to use his fists, but taught the world to use its voice, a man who sought glory but found meaning, a man who wanted to be remembered as the greatest but became something better, someone who showed us that even the greatest must fall, and that in the falling, in the facing of our inevitable defeats, with courage and grace, we discover what being human really means. The fire he felt as a child never died. It transformed. It burned through arrogance and became humility. It burned through anger and became wisdom. It burned through fear and became faith. And in the end, it burned away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only the truth that he was here, that he mattered, that he fought not just for himself, but for everyone who ever felt small or powerless or voiceless. And that fight, the one that began at a gymnasium window and ended in silence, the one that included triumphs and tragedies and everything in between. That fight never truly ends. It continues in every person who refuses to accept the limitations others try to impose. It continues in every voice that speaks truth, even when truth has consequences. It continues in every human being who dares to believe that they can be more than the world says they should be. He was the greatest, not because he never lost, but because he taught us how to lose without being defeated. Not because he was perfect, but because he was perfectly imperfect, gloriously flawed, courageously human. And when the final bell rang, when the last round ended, when the lights finally went out and the crowd dispersed and the legend became memory, what remained wasn't just the record of wins and losses, titles won and lost, predictions made and fulfilled. What remained was the understanding that we are all in the ring, all facing opponents we cannot defeat, all learning the same lesson he learned in his years of silence. That being alive means being vulnerable, that greatness includes suffering, that the story doesn't end with victory, but continues through defeat, through decline, through the long journey from power to humility, from invincibility to grace. He pressed his hand against the glass and promised to be great. He kept that promise in ways he never imagined, ways that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with being human in the fullest, most complete sense. And somewhere, always, there is a child at a window, watching others dance, feeling that fire begin to burn, whispering a promise that will shape a life, create a legend, and ultimately teach the world that we are not measured by our victories, but by our courage, not by our strength, but by our humanity, not by whether we fall, but by whether we rise, and rise again, and keep rising until rising means something different, something deeper, something that transcends the ring and the crowd and the glory to touch the eternal truth. That we are here, we matter, we fight. And that is enough. That is everything.